Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. This is your weekly update. I'm going to try to keep it short and simple and to the point because you have plenty of resources inside the course to be able to keep you on track with the actual content. I just want to talk about an overview of everything that's going to be coming up. As of this video posting, it will post on very, very early Thursday. You have until 5 p.m. on Thursday, again, to complete your second exploration. So right here. Also make sure that you're working in the reading quizzes. Keep in mind that, again, as assigned up here, I will assign by author when it's out of this tiny textbook. So I'll say something like Faulkner or Wright, and then just go to Faulkner and Wright's stories. You can find them right here in the content section at the very start of the entire book. Just make sure you look at the page numbers. Otherwise, page numbers apply directly to this book. I mentioned this briefly in the opening section, but I think it's a little confusing for some of you. All right, that moves us into the Gender in the South week. As you move into this content, make sure that you pay attention to the definitions that we'll use. One of the things that I always emphasize to classes whenever we talk about this particular topic is that keep in mind that when you're out in public, you can use words however you want to. When you're in a particular science, you use the words that, in the way that the science uses them. So, for example, when we go into really any natural science or social science and we say something like hypothesis is a very different, has a very different definition in there than it does necessarily out in public. Same thing with law. A scientific law is a very different thing than a law like what I have on the books, like the amendment to the constitutions or constitutions, like amendments, that trigger particular laws and things like that. So again, just keep in mind that this is not trying to force you to use words in a certain way. It's saying, inside this science, which is sociology, which is what we're using, these words are used in this particular fashion. So, for example, sex means biological fact. That's just, there are two main sexes in human beings. And then gender means the social or cultural enactment of that. So they were, from that perspective, literally hundreds of genders because, me right now, I'm wearing a t-shirt. That's a particular kind of male gender. If I wore a button-down shirt, if I wore a tuxedo, if I had a big beard and, had a jug or something like that, all of these are different kinds of enactments of masculinity in our culture. And so that's part of the topic. I'm going way off track here. Make sure you pay attention to that terminology, though, because that terminology will be used, especially as concerns Richard Wright's story. So make sure you know how Dave was a man, biologically speaking, who was almost a man, socially, culturally speaking, thus gender. Okay, so that's a brief overview of this. I'm going to talk a bit about the exam. When you click into the exam, keep in mind that you have one attempt at this exam. You have 120 minutes to be able to take the exam, and these are short answer questions. I cannot emphasize that enough. These are short answer questions. This is not multiple choice like the quizzes. It will probably take you at least an hour and a half, possibly the entire 2 hours. I have, I believe, 10 questions in there. And so you need to set aside time with a sturdy internet connection. Don't click into this and say, well, I'm just going to look at it and then go to work. It's not going to work that way. If you open it, and then you click away from it, it's a zero because then you didn't answer any of the questions. As well, make sure, I can't emphasize this enough, do not go and Google this information and then just put it in there, because if you do, that's a zero as well. It's plagiarism. You're still plagiarizing. I don't use a lockdown browser for exams because it's open book, because I would rather you have access to your book and your notes and everything. I believe that you need to be able to critically think about this, which is why they're short answer questions. But nonetheless, if I find any plagiarism in there, it's a zero, because you're not doing your work. You're not doing the reading. You're not keeping up with materials. You're not doing your part of the contract that is this course. So plan accordingly. Don't be intimidated. As long as you've done your reading, as long as you've kept up with the lectures and everything else, you should do great. As you know from listening to the podcast and everything else, I give big hints all the way throughout. Hey, this is going to reappear. In fact, and some of your feedback have even given you hints that some of these questions are going to reappear. I go out of my way to try to make sure that hey, I should really be paying attention to this. So be paying attention to it. But if you have any questions about that, let me know. Before you get started on it, pay attention to your exam review right here as well. That points you to, certain things that you can concentrate on. But also keep in mind that each of these things that I've given you here, that's not just one thing. I'm not just saying what year did the Jamestown colony start. It's nothing like that. what I would want to see is what were some of the reasons that the Jamestown colony started, as an example. That's not on there, but what were some of the reasons that the Jamestown colony started? And then that's a very complicated question, because then you get into social factors, European colonization, trade, and a whole host of things that we've examined as part of the history of the South. So those are the kinds of questions that you're going to see on this this exam. Just, again, keep that in mind. Let me know if you have questions before you start taking it. Otherwise, you have until June the 4th. As of this video posting, you also have access to the next set of materials in the course. We spend the majority of the time in the course talking about race. We have, if this were the full 16 weeks, we would spend 4 weeks of that. Since it's an 8-week class, we're going to spend 2 weeks. And the reason, I have some students ask me, and it's a good question, why do we spend so much time on race? And the reason is because there are over 400 years of history associated with this in the South. And we can't just pretend that it's gone as a problem, because it is a problem. I mean, we see this in the news even today. Recently, we've seen, problems with, interactions in the news. And so that 400 years of history didn't just disappear. It just started in 1619 when the first slaves arrived in the Virginia colony. Prior to that, by the way, if you count the Spanish rule, which dates back to really 1492, 1493, when Columbus first shows up. Getting off track again. But there are over, again, 400 years of history. So that's why we spend so much time on this, because it's not, it is something important and it needs to be addressed, and you need to understand the history of it if you're going to possibly understand the South. You cannot understand the South in the present. You cannot understand the history of the South if you do not understand the interactions between different races and the history of the slave trade as it concerns the entire South itself. Okay, so that's it. That gives you an overview of everything we're going to do going forward. I'll come back next week at this exact same time, and I'll talk even more about race. I just want to kind of cast forward. I know some of you are trying to work ahead. I will probably next week open up everything that remains in the course, just to go ahead and give you time to sort of self-pace. But again, I hesitate to do that just right off the bat, because I want you to get some feedback on your exploration so that you know exactly what my expectations are before you just start plowing ahead. See you later, and talk to you next week.